This is unprecedented. This is historic. This is absolutely devastating. Just minutes ago, the UK Supreme Court has issued a ruling that's sending shockwaves through every corner of British politics. They've ordered Prime Minister Keir Starmer to resign immediately over a financial scandal involving £124,000. We're not talking about suggestions or recommendations. We're talking about a direct order from the highest court in the land, telling a sitting Prime Minister that he must leave office. This has never happened before in British history. The legal reasoning is explosive, the evidence is damning, and the implications for democracy in Britain are staggering. How did a financial scandal escalate to the Supreme Court? What exactly did Starmer do with that money? And what happens now that the court has spoken? The next few minutes will reveal details that will shake you to your core. The scene at the Supreme Court today was unlike anything veteran legal observers have ever witnessed. Reporters packed into the courtroom knowing something big was coming, but nobody predicted this. When the Chief Justice began reading the judgment, you could hear a pin drop. Every word was measured, every sentence carefully constructed, because everyone in that room understood they were witnessing constitutional history being made. The justices didn't just rule against Starmer, they demolished his defence, tore apart his explanations and concluded that his conduct was so serious that remaining in office was constitutionally impossible. This wasn't a narrow technical judgment, this was a complete repudiation of everything Starmer had said about the scandal. Let's go back to how this all started, because the origins of this crisis are as important as the ending. The £124,000 at the centre of this scandal didn't just appear out of nowhere. This money came from sources that Starmer should never have been accepting money from, certainly not while serving as Prime Minister. The financial trail that investigators uncovered reads like a thriller novel. Money moving through multiple accounts, payments disguised as legitimate expenses, complex arrangements designed to hide the true nature of the transactions. When the first hints of this scandal emerged months ago, Starmer dismissed it as an accounting error, a misunderstanding, nothing to worry about. But investigators kept digging, and what they found got worse and worse. The initial reports suggested Starmer had received gifts and hospitality that weren't properly declared. That alone would have been bad enough, a breach of ministerial code that might force a resignation under normal circumstances. But as more information came to light, this scandal became much more serious. We're not just talking about somebody buying the Prime Minister dinner or giving him tickets to a football match. We're talking about substantial sums of money, totalling £124,000, that appeared to have been funneled to Starmer through arrangements that were clearly designed to avoid scrutiny. The more investigators looked at the financial records, the more suspicious everything became. Here's where it gets really damaging. Some of this money appears to have come from individuals and organisations that had direct business before the government. We're talking about people who were bidding for government contracts, companies that were seeking regulatory approval, organisations that stood to gain or lose millions based on government decisions. And these same entities were apparently channeling money to the Prime Minister through various means. The obvious implication, the one that prosecutors and investigators kept circling back to, was that this looked an awful lot like corruption. It looked like people were paying the Prime Minister for favourable treatment. Starmer's initial response was to deny everything. He claimed he'd done nothing wrong, that all the money was legitimate, that proper procedures had been followed. His legal team issued statements saying there was no case to answer. They argued that every payment was either a personal loan, a campaign contribution that was allowed under the rules, or reimbursement for expenses he'd legitimately incurred. They said critics were twisting innocent transactions into something sinister. They accused the opposition and the media of running a political hit job designed to bring down a democratically elected Prime Minister. For a while, that defence seemed to be working. Public opinion was divided. Some people believed Starmer, others didn't, but there wasn't clear evidence of wrongdoing. Then the documents leaked. Someone with access to Starmer's financial records, and we still don't know who, gave detailed documentation to investigators and the media. Bank statements, emails, contracts, agreements, the whole paper trail that showed exactly where the money came from and where it went. And these documents completely contradicted everything Starmer had been saying. Payments that he claimed were loans had no loan agreements and no repayment schedules. Campaign contributions came from people who exceeded legal limits by routing money through multiple sources. Expenses that he claimed to have incurred couldn't be verified and looked suspiciously inflated. The documentary evidence painted a picture of someone who was systematically evading the rules while lying about it. The political pressure became intense immediately. Opposition parties called for Starmer's resignation. Members of his own party started distancing themselves from him. The media went into full investigative mode, digging up more and more damaging information every day. But Starmer refused to step down. He insisted he'd done nothing that required his resignation, that he would fight to clear his name, that he wouldn't be driven from office by a media witch hunt. His stubbornness in the face of mounting evidence started to look less like principled determination and more like arrogant denial. People wondered what he was hiding and why he was so desperate to cling to power. That's when the legal case began. A group of citizens supported by anti-corruption organisations filed a formal legal challenge. They argued that Starmer's conduct violated multiple laws regarding financial disclosure, conflicts of interest and abuse of public office. They asked the courts to intervene and force his removal from office. Legal experts initially thought this case had little chance of success. British courts are traditionally very reluctant to interfere in political matters. The conventional wisdom is that if a Prime Minister loses the confidence of Parliament or the public, that's a political problem to be solved through political means, not legal ones. But this case was different because the evidence of actual law breaking was so strong. The case moved through the legal system with unusual speed. Lower court has heard preliminary arguments and allowed the case to proceed, finding that there were serious questions to be answered. Each ruling against Starmer's attempts to have the case dismissed added momentum to the legal challenge. His lawyers fought every step of the way, using every procedural tool available to delay and obstruct. But the evidence was too strong and the legal arguments against him too compelling. Eventually, the case reached the Supreme Court, the final word on legal matters in the United Kingdom, and that's where everything came to a head. The Supreme Court hearing was extraordinary. For days, the justices heard arguments from both sides. Starmer's legal team presented a defence that essentially boiled down to arguing that even if he'd broken some rules, it wasn't serious enough to warrant forced removal from office. They claimed that only Parliament could remove a Prime Minister, that courts had no role in this process, that allowing judicial intervention would undermine democracy. The other side presented devastating evidence of financial misconduct and argued that nobody, not even a Prime Minister, was above the law. They said that if Starmer had committed crimes while in office, the courts absolutely had the power and the duty to act. The justices asked pointed questions that made clear they were taking this very seriously. They grilled Starmer's lawyers about specific transactions, demanding explanations for payments that made no sense. They questioned how the Prime Minister could claim he didn't know about financial arrangements that were made in his name. They seemed sceptical of arguments that this was all innocent misunderstanding. Legal observers watching the hearing started predicting that Starmer was in serious trouble. The tone and content of the justices' questions suggested they were building toward a damning judgment. When the court adjourned to consider its verdict, Westminster went into a state of suspended animation. Everyone knew that whatever the Supreme Court decided would be momentous. If they ruled in Starmer's favour, he would be emboldened and his political enemies would be devastated. If they ruled against him, it could end his career and potentially change British constitutional law forever. The waiting period was agonising. Behind the scenes, frantic negotiations were apparently taking place. Some reports suggested that intermediaries were approaching Starmer to suggest he resign voluntarily before the judgment came down to avoid the humiliation of being ordered out of office by the courts. But Starmer refused, apparently confident that the courts wouldn't dare force a Prime Minister to resign. That confidence was completely misplaced. When the Supreme Court reconvened to deliver its judgment, the atmosphere was electric. The Chief Justice began by outlining the legal principles at stake. This wasn't just about Starmer personally. This was about whether the rule of law applied to everyone, including the most powerful person in government. The Chief Justice spoke about the importance of public trust in democratic institutions and how financial corruption, even the appearance of corruption, undermined the entire system. And then came the bombshell. The court found that Starmer had indeed violated multiple laws regarding financial conduct and conflicts of interest. But the ruling went further than anyone expected. The justices didn't just say Starmer had broken the law. They said his conduct was so serious, so damaging to public trust, and so incompatible with the duties of his office that he could not lawfully continue to serve as Prime Minister. They issued what legal experts are calling an unprecedented order, directly instructing Starmer to resign from office. The reasoning was that someone who had committed these offences while serving as the nation's leader had fundamentally betrayed the trust placed in them and had no legal or moral basis to continue exercising executive power. The courtroom erupted. Journalists were frantically typing and calling their newsrooms. Lawyers were stunned by the boldness of the ruling, and Starmer's legal team looked absolutely shell-shocked. They'd expected the worst-case scenario to be a finding of wrongdoing that would increase political pressure on Starmer to resign. They never imagined the courts would actually order his removal. The Chief Justice continued reading the judgment, laying out in meticulous detail exactly what Starmer had done wrong, why it mattered, and why resignation was the only appropriate remedy. Every paragraph was another nail in the coffin of his political career. The specific findings in the judgment are devastating. The court found that Starmer had knowingly accepted money from individuals who had matters pending before the government. They found that he had failed to properly disclose these payments as required by law. They found that he had made false statements about the nature and source of the money when questions were first raised. They found that he had attempted to obstruct the investigation by withholding documents and giving misleading testimony. And critically, they found that these weren't innocent mistakes, but deliberate choices made by someone who knew exactly what he was doing and why it was wrong. The judgment specifically addressed Starmer's argument that only Parliament could remove a Prime Minister. The justices acknowledged that this is normally true in political disputes about policy or leadership. But they said this case was fundamentally different because it involved serious violations of law, not political disagreements. They said the courts absolutely have jurisdiction to intervene when office holders, even the highest ones, commit crimes or serious misconduct. They compared it to how courts can remove judges or other officials who violate their duties. The Prime Minister, they ruled, is not exempt from legal accountability just because he holds high office. The £124,000 was broken down in painful detail in the judgment. The court traced where every pound came from and how it found its way to Starmer. Some of it came through what appeared to be sham consulting arrangements where Starmer was supposedly being paid for advice he never actually gave. Some came through inflated speaking fees where he was paid vastly more than market rate for brief appearances. Some came through payments to family members or associates that were clearly intended for Starmer's benefit. The justices methodically dismantled every explanation Starmer had offered, showing how the evidence contradicted his claims at every turn. What makes this even more shocking is that the court also found evidence suggesting the £124,000 might not be the full extent of the problem. The judgment notes that this figure represents only the payments that investigators were able to definitively trace and document. There are suggestions in the ruling that there may have been other payments, other arrangements, other sources of money that haven't yet been fully uncovered. The court stopped short of making definitive findings about these other potential issues, but they made clear that the £124,000 is likely just the tip of the iceberg. The reaction to the Supreme Court ruling has been absolutely explosive. Within minutes of the judgment being released, Downing Street was in chaos. Staff were reportedly running around trying to figure out what to do. Constitutional experts were being called in for emergency consultations. The cabinet was summoned for an immediate meeting, and everyone was asking the same question. What happens now? Britain has never been in this situation before. A Supreme Court has never ordered a Prime Minister to resign. There's no clear precedent, no established procedure for how this is supposed to work. Starmer's initial response, delivered through a spokesman while he was still digesting the ruling, was defiant. He said he disagreed with the court's judgment, believed it was wrong both legally and constitutionally, and would be considering all his options, including a possible appeal. But legal experts immediately pointed out that there's no appeal from a Supreme Court ruling. This is the final word. The law is settled. Starmer can disagree all he wants, but that doesn't change the legal reality that the highest court in the land has ordered him to resign. His defiance was starting to look less like strength and more like desperate denial. The political fallout has been immediate and severe. Members of Starmer's own cabinet have started distancing themselves from him. Several have reportedly already offered their resignations, not wanting to be associated with a government led by someone the Supreme Court has found to be corrupt. Opposition parties are demanding that Starmer comply with the court order immediately and calling for emergency sessions of Parliament to deal with the crisis. There are suggestions that if Starmer refuses to resign voluntarily, Parliament might need to take formal action to remove him, though exactly what that would look like is unclear. The constitutional crisis this creates is staggering. Britain's system of government is based on conventions and traditions more than written rules. The idea that courts would intervene to remove a Prime Minister was considered almost unthinkable until today. But the Supreme Court has now established a new principle. If a Prime Minister commits serious offences and refuses to resign voluntarily, the courts can and will force them out. This fundamentally changes the balance of power in the British system. It gives the judiciary a role in policing the executive branch that goes beyond anything previously imagined. Some people are celebrating this as a victory for the rule of law and accountability. Others are warning that it's a dangerous expansion of judicial power into areas that should be left to politics. International reaction has been swift and concerned. Britain's allies are watching this crisis with alarm, worried about what it means for the stability and reliability of the British government. Financial markets have reacted negatively to the uncertainty, with the pound dropping and stock prices falling. Other countries are wondering if agreements made with Starmer's government will still be honoured by whatever government comes next. Britain's reputation as a stable, reliable democracy has taken a serious hit. The image of a Prime Minister being ordered out of office by the courts, potentially dragged out kicking and screaming, is not the kind of thing that inspires international confidence. Behind the scenes, frantic efforts are underway to manage this crisis. Senior politicians from all parties are reportedly in contact trying to figure out a path forward. The King, as head of state, is being briefed constantly about constitutional options. Civil servants are preparing for the possibility of a change in government leadership with no clear timeline or process. And everyone is trying to game out what Starmer will actually do. Will he comply with the court order and resign, preserving at least some dignity? Will he try to fight it, forcing a constitutional showdown? Or will he try some kind of middle path, perhaps announcing he'll step down, but only after some delay to ensure an orderly transition? The evidence laid out in the Supreme Court judgment has shocked even people who thought they understood the extent of the scandal. Reading through the ruling, you see a pattern of conduct that's hard to explain away as innocent mistakes. You see someone who appeared to be systematically taking money from people who wanted something from the government, hiding those payments through complex arrangements, and then lying about it when questions were asked. The judgment uses careful legal language, but the picture it paints is of a Prime Minister who was fundamentally corrupt, who saw his office as an opportunity for personal enrichment, and who thought he could get away with it. Some of the specific incidents detailed in the judgment are particularly damning. There's an account of how Starmer met with a businessman who was bidding for a major government contract. Within weeks of that meeting, money started flowing to Starmer through a third-party arrangement. Shortly after that, the businessman's company won the contract despite not having the lowest bid. The judgment is careful to say that direct quid pro quo corruption wasn't definitively proven in this instance, but the sequence of events and the financial trail are deeply suspicious. And this is just one example. The ruling describes multiple similar patterns where money to Starmer seemed to correlate with favourable government decisions. The defence that Starmer's legal team offered for these payments, as described in the judgment, is almost laughable. They claimed he was being paid for his expertise and advice, that businessmen valued his insights and were willing to pay premium rates for access to his thinking. But the court found no evidence that Starmer actually provided any meaningful advice or services. There were no work products, no documented consultations, no evidence of time spent on these supposed consulting arrangements. The payments looked like what they probably were: bribes disguised as legitimate transactions, and the court didn't hesitate to say so in language that was barely coded. The reaction from the public has been a mixture of vindication and disgust. People who suspected Starmer was corrupt all along feel validated by the Supreme Court ruling. They're angry that it took this long and went this far before the truth came out. People who supported and voted for Starmer feel betrayed and lied to. They believed his denials and his explanations, and now they feel foolish for having trusted him. The broader impact on trust in politics and politicians is severe. If the Prime Minister can be this corrupt and lie about it this brazenly, who can you trust? The cynicism and disillusionment are palpable. As I'm recording this, we still don't know exactly what Starmer will do in response to the Supreme Court order. Early indications suggest he's considering defying the ruling, claiming it's unconstitutional and that only Parliament can remove him from office. If he takes that path, Britain will be in completely uncharted constitutional territory. What happens if a Prime Minister simply refuses to obey a Supreme Court order? Can he be physically removed from Downing Street? Would Parliament have to pass emergency legislation? Would the King have to intervene and dismiss him? Nobody knows, because nothing like this has ever happened before. The Labour Party itself is in meltdown over this scandal. MPs who supported Starmer and defended him are now facing furious constituents who want to know why they stood by someone the Supreme Court has found to be corrupt. The party's reputation has been badly damaged. There are already calls for a complete leadership change, not just replacing Starmer, but clearing out everyone associated with him and starting fresh. Some are even suggesting the party needs to call a general election and seek a new mandate from the people. Though, given how toxic the party has become, that might be political suicide. The £124,000 at the centre of this scandal represents more than just money. It represents a betrayal of public trust, a corruption of democratic institutions, and a fundamental failure of character. For Starmer to have taken this money while serving as Prime Minister, to have hidden it, to have lied about it, and then to have fought tooth and nail to avoid accountability, shows someone who placed his own interests above his duty to the country. The Supreme Court ruling is a statement that this kind of conduct is intolerable and that nobody, regardless of how powerful they are, is above the law.